far-right protesters and QAnon conspiracy theorists rioting on the steps of the Bundestag, although they were unable to breach the building itself. So what parallels do you see between these two events and the online movements that led to real-world political violence?
Yeah, there really was a striking resemblance in terms of the scenes that we were seeing in late August in Berlin and the riots in front of the Capitol. And really, in both cases, what we saw was that there was a fairly broad range of actors coming together. So for some of your American viewers who may be slightly less familiar with the German events, we really saw a cross-section of people from conspiracy theorists, QAnon supporters, supporters of the AfD, the far-right party in the German parliament, members of the ethno-nationalist identitarian movement, all the way to known Holocaust deniers, really kind of coalesce around the overwhelm a slightly overmatched police force, and then wave the flag of the German Reich in front of the Bundestag, a highly symbolic political building, of course. And this slightly strange seeming combination of people really has been connected through some of the opportunities provided by social media platforms. And this is not just the big platforms anymore. It's not just your Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. In Germany, especially, our monitoring at the Institute has shown that especially alternative platforms that are less moderated, such as Telegram, such as Parler, have really gained a massive amount of followers during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. It has really brought this wide coalition of actors together. And as we have seen in the case of the events in Berlin in late August, as well as in the similar lead up to the Capitol riots, this is not just something that stays in the online sphere, but that's also able to manifest offline eventually.
Yeah, and if I may just add in on that, and also thank you so much for hosting us this afternoon or this morning to people. I think that, you know, that looking at the parallels for what played out in the US, but then also in Germany several months before, I think broadly speaks to a key trend which we have seen really across the contexts which we're analysing in Europe, in North America, and in Oceania at the Institute. And really, what I mean by this is when we look at extreme right-wing mobilization and far-right mobilization, we're increasingly seeing the ability for broad church coalitions of different actors really, you know, running from the very extreme supremacist fringes into perhaps slightly more mainstream conspiracy theorist communities or populist audiences, connecting, building common narratives, sharing common grievances, and then quite opportunistically seizing on key moments as an opportunity to advance their talking points and to agitate. As Jacob says, this is very much linked, as we see it, to often very frenetic online activities. So rapid fire interplay between these different actors, between these different groups online, enabling them to build these common narratives around shared conspiracy theories, which we then see activate. And to that point on the sort of conspiracy theory piece in particular, I think this is really important to underline. When we talk about the extreme right, and when we look at the threat posed by the extreme right wing and by hate groups, this is increasingly becoming hybridized. Which not just extremist activity which they're mobilizing, it's now becoming fused with the widespread proliferation of disinformation, with the promotion of conspiracy theories more widely, creating these kind of hybrid monsters which are able to spring into action really relatively quickly.
So on that note, how much exchange is there actually between American and European ideologies and the movements themselves? Because after the Christchurch shooting in 2019 in New Zealand, it was shown that the shooter had extensive contact to the Austrian identitarian movement, which is a far-right white nationalist movement in Europe. But the Halle synagogue shooter, for example, radicalized almost completely online, although he expressed very similar sentiments. So how tightly or loosely knit are these groups, and what mechanisms are really creating this transatlantic and transnational link? And sort of as a follow-up, what direction is information flowing? Who is influencing who?
Thanks, Eric. That's a really great, well, I say questions, set of questions. So I think there's a few different bits to unpick there. I mean, first of all, I think your sort of characterization of this as transnational is entirely correct. Broadly speaking, over the past few years of monitoring, and I would say increasingly so over the past 5 years, we have charted an increasingly internationalized extreme right wing, both across the English-speaking world, within Europe, but then also between these different contexts, including across the Atlantic. And this transnationalization is really driven, as I would say it, by social media. Social media itself has lowered the barrier for entry into extremist movements, enabling people to come into contact with extremist ideology with really relative ease. But it's also created these global networks of people. So, you know, you think 20, 30 years ago, you'd have to go to the rally or you'd have to go to the seedy bar to meet up with the people who had these same sort of talking points. You don't need that now. You can sit as your computer, as I'm doing, and have discourse about the future of the white race with strangers on the other side of the world. And so when we unpick this sort of transnational components, I think there are a few different bits. Firstly, we're seeing the build out of a more cohesive culture, which drives this extremist activity. Secondly, we're seeing the build out of shared ideological talking points, which are often tied into broader narratives around a shared struggle. And then more specifically, we also do see quite specific collaboration around key events, sort of in terms of amplifying messages. So on the culture side of things, if you look at the internet culture, which underpins many of these conspiracy theorist communities or these extremist communities, that has really provided a sort of a cultural glue, if you like, which brings people together, and they start using the same jokes, they start using the same terms, they start using the same memes, and that allows the build out of a bit more of a shared identity. On the ideological perspective, we also see a sort of a two-way flow of direction in terms of the build out of sort of common ideological tropes. So a good example of this, I think, in terms of the ideology originating in Europe and then spreading throughout the world is the Great Replacement theory, which was really influential in the Christchurch attack. The idea that so-called ethnic Europeans are being replaced in their homeland through immigration. Now, this originated in France several years ago with the French philosopher René Camus. But what we saw there is, after flittering through ethno-nationalist identitarian groups, this sort of pan-European extreme right community, which is very much opposed to Islam and migration, this idea then spread globally through the use of social media and has now become a key talking point. So we see this similarly with ideas such as the white genocide theory, the idea that there is a deliberate genocide being waged against white people. And what this sort of shared ideology allows is the build out of a shared struggle. You're no longer fighting against migrants or minority communities coming to your city or your town or your country. You're fighting against this overwhelming assault against the white race internationally. And this is really how these groups see themselves. And this means that you will have American extremists looking at what's happening in Germany with flows of with migration and using that to justify their activity and using disinformation around migrant crime as a sort of justification for their activity. And really this is in part linked to this sort of shared architecture and this shared tactical playbook. I realized, sorry, that was quite a long there, but that was a long question with much to respond to.
Maybe just a couple points I would want to add on that is, I think the example of the Halle attack in Germany is actually really instructive here. So this was an anti-Semitic terror attack of an attacker that acted alone, but very much radicalized in a social environment online around image boards, around 4chan, 8chan, made repeated reference within his manifesto and live stream to these kind of online far-right subcultures. And what was really interesting is that he wrote his manifesto in English and he also spoke in broken English during his live stream, addressing very much an international audience and portraying himself as someone who's part of the global white race, the global struggle of white populations. And this is quite a distinct break with the old traditions of right-wing extremism in Europe. This is someone who doesn't anymore, or not primarily identifies himself as a German nationalist, of French nationalist, English nationalist. This is a kind of transnational identity and ideology that's emerging there, fueled by the abilities provided by the borderless nature of the internet. And this is really, I think, the other way around, if you will. Jake mentioned some of these sort of pseudo-highbrow intellectual ideas that traveled from the French New Right into the American alt-right and the American far-right more broadly. But some of these cultural elements have really been quite very much imported from the US through social media platforms such as 4chan, the kind of transgressive, provocative humor that we see, the memes, the kind of aesthetics, and been picked up by opportunistic far-right activists in Europe. And so really, this is kind of a two-way street in terms of cross-fertilization.
Thank you so much. To focus in a little bit on QAnon, many of QAnon's beliefs have their roots in anti-Semitism. Could you speak a little bit on how anti-Semitism fits into the larger picture of Q's ideology and movement?
Yeah, of course. So I think, when looking and when talking about anti-Semitism and its relationship with QAnon, it's also quite pertinent to talk more broadly about anti-Semitism and its relationship with conspiracy theories writ large. QAnon itself is built around this notion of a shadowy, satanic elite, if you like, which has its fingers in all sorts of pies and controls the world. And that idea, that focus on people pulling the strings is really consistent to a lot of conspiracy theories. I'll say a lot, not necessarily all, not all flat earthers necessarily go that far, but by and large. And when you sort of dig into that, what you see is quite both implicit and overt calls to and references to really well-established anti-Semitic tropes, which have been used to denigrate and attack Jews in Europe and globally for many, many years. The idea that Jewish people have, some sort of secret control over global events. And so, while QAnon itself might not always be very explicitly, overtly anti-Semitic, as some of the activity we might see in other extreme right communities might be, what you see is it leaves open the door for anti-Semites to come in and to then add that sort of next explanation. So, okay, who Q's talking about. Let me show you who Q's talking about, that sort of thing. And so really it's kind of a proximity of ideas which allows entryism. I mean, also sort of following from there and looking at some of the responses of the QAnon community specifically to COVID-19, we've also seen tropes, references to other anti-Semitic tropes. So we've seen, for example, this not to be sort of crass or crude sort of discussion there around the torture of children to inform the creation of a vaccine, for example. That was a QAnon trope. And when you look at the people who are meant to be torturing these children, a lot of them are Jewish people. Now here what we see is a direct reference to the really historic, long-running anti-Semitic trope of blood libel being revamped and repackaged for the modern age. And this is a consistent pattern which we see with a lot of these communities. They wait to see what the current events are, what the current event hook is, and will then repackage these long-standing hateful tropes to fit that narrative.
And I do think it can, in certain contexts, be quite important to sort of like really dive into and explain how anti-Semitism manifests within the QAnon context, because sometimes there have been a few media reports where it was sort of QAnon was described as an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, but it wasn't sort of explained in great depth. And I think for people who aren't following this very closely and who don't read a lot of QAnon Telegram channels, and who maybe aren't experts sort of in the field or sort of adjacent fields, I think it'll be quite difficult to then follow the plot and understand why that is the case. So I think while obviously trying to not amplify extremist or anti-Semitic propaganda or sort of uncritically reproduce it, I think it can, within certain contexts, be quite important to really explain these issues so people can follow along.
Thanks for really digging into that specific aspect of the QAnon conspiracy theory. It's no secret that QAnon began in the United States, but what is perhaps surprising to many people is that it has found such a strong foothold in Germany. Germany has the largest amount of supporters of QAnon of all non-English speaking countries. Could you cite any specific reason why this might be, or a working hypothesis why the conspiracy has such a strong foothold in Germany?
Yeah, I mean, so QAnon really was at a very low level present in Germany very, very early on. I mean, there have been sort of conspiracy theory influencers who started referencing it in late 2017, very, very immediately after it came up or developed on platforms such as 8chan. But it continued. Like we saw during our work at ISD in the lead up to the Bavarian elections, we saw groups just literally kind of like copy and pasting and translating QAnon content from English channels and pages. But again, this stayed at a relatively low level until the beginning of 2020, really until March and the beginning of the COVID crisis. And from then onwards, we really see like a massive rise in the far right in general, but specifically in conspiracy theory channels and specifically QAnon content. And I think this is in part because conspiracy theories are very handsome way to explain societal crisis and the kind of loss of control that people feel. It provides very easy explanations for what's wrong. It sort of assigns scapegoats. And obviously therefore also suggests quite easy solutions out of a crisis. Like if there's someone who's clearly to blame for it, you just need to get rid of this person or these people, and then you don't really need to make all these tough considerations about how to deal with such a complex pandemic anymore. But I think the reason why it was specifically QAnon was that it functions as this kind of like meta conspiracy that's able to integrate different types of narratives and different types of conspiracy thinking into like a broader theory. It is almost like the tofu of online conspiracy theories that sort of really takes on the flavor of the stuff that it's surrounded by. What it was surrounded by in Germany was a very, very active conspiracy theory community already, concerned about issues such as vaccines, concerned about, so there's this community in Germany called the Reichsbürger, which is, I guess you could roughly translate as citizens of the Reich. This is a far-right group, or well, it's multiple far-right groups, but for simplicity's sake, a far-right group who believes that the German Federal Republic after 1945 is illegitimate and the German Reich sort of continues to live on. I mean, there's an obvious connection to far-right and historically revisionist thought there, and they don't recognize the legitimacy of the present-day Federal Republic of Germany. And really the QAnon conspiracy community and the Reichsbürger community have heavily intersected. And it also, QAnon has been able to essentially attach itself to narratives that were quite popular among the sort of anti-refugee bit of the far right. So obviously in 2015, after there was a lot of refugees coming to Germany, there was obviously a lot of unhappiness about this in some corners. There was a lot of criticism towards Merkel, sort of like people really being very unhappy with her, being very vicious about her and her sort of centrist establishment politics that was too friendly and too welcoming. And really these kind of grievances were, I think, all integrated. And it was said like now in the context of QAnon, the narrative goes this way. Unlike historical German far-right extremists who would have been very resentful towards the US, been very resentful towards the West, partially because of the defeat in World War II, these people essentially looked at the QAnon conspiracy in which Donald Trump obviously is the kind of messiah, the savior figure, and said like, this is the savior who's going to liberate us from the Merkel regime. Again, kind of a term that developed in the context of the refugee crisis. And they were arguing that this maneuver by NATO, Defender 2020, I believe, in March, that this was essentially an attempt by Trump, a secret plan to liberate Germany from the Merkel regime, and that now COVID was essentially this sinister plot to squash that plan and keep the Germans in the hand of the Merkel regime. And this was, as nutty as it sounds, it developed quite widely, especially on platforms such as Telegram and other alternative platforms. And it was partially then also fueled by the fact that a series of A and B celebrities, including a very famous singer, a very famous vegan cook, a very famous rapper, to different degrees of explicitness, essentially referenced these conspiracy beliefs and therefore really made them more broadly accessible to a very wide audience that then streamed towards Telegram, where really in Germany you see an incredibly wide network of channels, far right and conspiracy channels, and all kinds of overlaps of the two. Hundreds of channels with, at times, more than 100,000 followers all day long, spreading these beliefs, and that have really radicalized with immense speed, pushing up the numbers for the QAnon movement in Germany.
So that sort of begs the question then, what's to be done? After the Capitol storming, Twitter and a number of other social media companies deplatformed former President Trump, and indeed content around QAnon and conspiracy theories surrounding it decreased. So is deplatforming a viable option for preventing radicalization and the spread of extremist movements? Or how can governments and civil society really combat these movements with political violence at their core?
So I think what needs to be quite clear is what the objectives are with deplatforming. I mean, there's different threats or different risks to be concerned about in terms of extremism, in terms of the far right. One of them could be just the mainstreaming of extremism, the normalization of extremist and hateful rhetoric. And I think that is undoubtedly limited by deplatforming. I mean, you can't, for example, with the French identitarians or the kind of transnational identitarian movement who really relies on a strategy of meta politics, influencing culture, influencing discourse, to shift the Overton window towards the far right. You can't do that without an audience. You can't do it without having a lot of reach. So in that sense, I think deplatforming can be quite effective. If you look, though, at another objective that you may have with deplatforming, which is to prevent violence, to prevent the radicalization of individuals or small groups, I think the outcomes there might be slightly more ambivalent, because what you do is you drive people towards these fringe spaces like Telegram, like Parler, like Odyssey, where they're surrounded by much more extreme discourse and are potentially more prone to radicalizing and eventually moving into action. So I think it's quite important to keep your objectives in mind. It is likely, to my understanding, I'm not a lawyer, but I think in most legal contexts, it will be, the platforms will be within their legal rights to restrict freedom of opinion in a more comprehensive way than is legally demanded by them. So I think that's the kind of legal perspective on that. Facebook is entitled to remove hate groups they don't like, even if those are operating legally. But I think lastly, also, it's important that there's a wider context around these debates, around cancel culture, around the allegations of a potential liberal bias of tech companies. And I think really one of the issues there is, I think the deplatforming measures really need to be tied to behavior. I think it's very harmful for public discourse and the perception of a liberal bias on behalf of the platforms if they are seen to be essentially disproportionately policing one side of the political spectrum. And therefore, I think it's quite important that this is tied to behavior. And we're really lacking transparency there from the platforms, that we don't have enough data access as independent researchers to look at cases of deplatforming, to look at the behavior and the posts that led to deplatforming and make an evaluation. Were these fair? Is there a political bias here? Or is it just, which is also possible, that just one side of the political spectrum more often engages in certain behavior that contravenes the platform standards? So we really, on this question, need more transparency and data access from the platforms.
I mean, just to pick up from that, I mean, maybe just to sort of draw a line under it, though. I mean, we do have evidence that this is effective in stopping extremists at reaching their audiences, aside from anything, because the extremists tell us as much. So if you look to Milo Yiannopoulos, for example, who was the alt-right figure who was popular a few years ago, when he got kicked off Facebook and Twitter, we could see in his sort of fringe Telegram channels that he wasn't happy about this, but he was also saying, look, what's the point of me continuing this activity if I can only reach 6,000 people when just the other week I had an audience of millions, right? And I think this is sort of underlining it. I think it's absolutely imperative that these platforms, these very big platforms, who quite often have business models which promote and amplify extremist content, and we know this because again, they tell us Facebook had internal documents leaked which said that 60% of people found extremist content because of their internal algorithms. Now I think it is essential that they take a measured stand and try and stop this. But unfortunately, I think we have sort of reached the stage where they can't necessarily be trusted to do so. Now, as advocates and as researchers, quite a lot of our time is spent using a range of methods, some of these manual and some of these sort of big data analysis to identify emerging threats on platforms. The problem is quite often the platforms don't want to hear about this and take action proactively. It takes a real crisis, and quite often ongoing crises where people are being killed, for them to take notice, and even them, not always. So I think that, broadly speaking, when you ask us around solutions now, as we understand it, there is probably the need to move towards regulation, as we've seen play out in a few different contexts. Now, in Germany with the Next EG law, for example, that was around content. But when we look at it and when we understand it, I think, okay, you can ask extremists, you can ask social media platforms to get rid of content if they're promoting hate speech. I actually think that we need to go further than that, and we need to understand and encourage transparency, if that's through law, the internal mechanisms and the internal drivers of these platforms, which might be actively facilitating and actively engaging radicalization. I think beyond that, it is also important that we try and find ways to deal with these fringe platforms as well. I think, as Jacob said, there are always going to be, unfortunately, a small set of hardened extremists who are going to be looking for ways to communicate, to plot, to encourage attacks. And we see this playing out on platforms like Telegram. Okay, so at ISD, I think we're in over 600 public Telegram channels which you can get at by going on the app and searching for keywords. I won't say them here, which contain not only violent, egregious racism as the rule, but also very explicit instructions on how to 3D print a weapon, or craft a gun as the Haller shooter did. In this case, I think it's also essential that there is more robust engagement with these platforms when they're hosting illegal content, or when they're promoting this very harmful behaviors to come around the table. I think very quickly, though, just to go beyond the sort of the policy questions and the policy considerations, I think there are also other things and other programs which government and which civil society can do and can adopt and should be investing more in, which can both tackle extremism online head on and at its root causes. And these are a few things which at the Institute we've been trialing for a number of years now. So firstly, education initiatives. I think it is essential that good critical thinking skills, but also skills on teaching young people around how to stay safe online, how to be an appropriate digital citizen, are taught in schools. Beyond that, there are then a range of other initiatives which I think really need a closer look at. So in the offline space, and indeed also online, trying to find programs which can actively engage with people who are expressing support for extremist activity, to try and bring them back from the brink of that, to try and have a conversation, help people understand the harmful nature of these groups and ultimately help them leave those groups. I think that's important. I also think there are a range of other things which people aren't doing in that space online. I think, for example, there's great scope to be more experimental in how people are talking online. Okay, the social media and social media spaces present a discursive, an opportunity for conversation as their bare function. I think we should be thinking more creatively around how we can use those online spaces to be starting those conversations, so conversations which can try and sway people's mind and bring them back from the edge of hate.
Thank you. But now, what are you seeing in these online spaces, in the Telegram channels, 4 months after the Capitol storming, and that so many of Q's predictions have failed? How has the movement evolved? Has it lost steam? Is this a much longer term problem? Just quickly, generally categorizing the direct aftermath and where you see this heading.
So I think sort of with a particular focus on QAnon here, we have seen the movement become more diluted. Some members realized they were duped and have dropped off, and there's been quite a lot of public discussion around that. But there are still dedicated QAnon communities which have sort of doubled down. People who essentially reread the QAnon material almost like Bible verses and are still being convinced by these sort of big grifting influencers online that the plan is still in motion. They're doubling down. More broadly, though, we've seen quite a lot of this sort of become dispersed and diluted into a broader conspiracy theory space. And I think this is a thing which I think is important to stress when talking about this sort of activity. QAnon was a global conspiracy theories movement, but it won't be the last. And I think that we need to move the conversation on a little bit beyond just QAnon, which is perhaps the most sort of publicly well-known and crazy theory out there, and start to actually think about this as a broader long-term trend, which ultimately I think has severe repercussions for radicalization, posing a threat to democracy writ large, and to the spread of disinformation. And I think it's important to think about QAnon as a blueprint for online conspiracy theory communities. And I think the ideas which were put out by these groups of doing your own research, not being led by the media, coming to your own conclusions about the way the world is run, have now become, a huge rallying cry for COVID conspiracy theories. I think for a lot of people, that's also very empowering. So I don't think we'll necessarily see this sort of movement go away anywhere. It will just reappear with slightly different branding or slightly different figureheads, depending on the context.
At this point, I want to open up the questioning to the audience, and I will turn it over to my colleague, Juliana, who will read the questions to the panelists. Juliana?
Yes, the first question is from Raymond Termini, and he's asking, what roles are the United Nations and the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, taking in countering extremist financing?
Sorry, I can start this. I have less specific analysis on the Financial Action Task Force, but what we can see through some of our own analysis is the sort of broader dynamics by which extremists are raising funds online, which I could speak to briefly if helpful. What we did, and we did some analysis last year looking at hate groups, particularly in the US, and the way they were raising money. What we found was looking at, I think it was over 70 different online funding platforms, so things like donate buttons or online shops architectures or what have you, was that a resounding majority of these platforms are still being used by extremists. Online fundraising mechanisms writ large, I think, still pose sort of a major challenge, in that a large number of them still don't have any terms of service in place, as you would see on Facebook or as you would see on Twitter, around governing what's appropriate use, with the result that doors are left open for extremists. And we're seeing this increasingly now with completely unregulated spaces like cryptocurrency becoming a pull for action for these groups. A big thing, though, is a big trend also here to sort of flag is the large institutions or sort of setups designed to capture large flows of money probably won't be very effective for what we see with these sorts of groups. It's not the case that there are millions and millions of dollars or euros flowing to explicit extremist organizations. It's the case that you have individual users or individual supporters sending kind of like $500 here and $500 there for a range of different mechanisms. So I think actually sort of tracking that through infrastructure which is designed to sort of look at larger scale financial transactions is going to be tricky. But I would say that more broadly, when we're looking at these fundraising mechanisms, particularly around hate groups, there is the need for sort of a concerted policy push and a concerted policy question around how they're facilitating extremist groups. And we see this through platforms like Amazon, for example, still being used to sell extremist propaganda, still allowing people to profit off that, still profiting off that themselves. So I think there is really the need for sort of a deeper and more prolonged conversation looking at this.
And just a reminder to the audience, you may submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Thank you, Jacob, for that answer. Juliana, other questions?
The second question is from Frank Mulehall. He's saying Steve Bannon came to Europe to unite the right, but it didn't really seem to be successful, with some obvious disdain from the European far right for what he stands for. Is this cause for some optimism that ultimately these groups are hard to bind together internationally despite sharing plenty of mutual enemies, real and imagined?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting question. And the Bannon example there, obviously, we did closely follow. I mean, just as a kind of like slightly bizarre anecdote of something that I've been observing at a similar time, really, there was a decision at some point taken by Mr. Salvini in Italy while they were still in government, his party was still in government, that he would essentially reject refugees that were sent back from Germany to Italy as part of the kind of Dublin agreements. And somewhat to my surprise, I would have thought the kind of German anti-migrant communities online would be terribly upset about this. They were actually very much celebrating Salvini for taking such a strong stance on behalf of his nation. Even though from their perspective, you would have thought they should be quite unhappy that essentially the refugees were staying in Germany. And so I think this points at something. I mean, this is to some extent, it is an opposition kind of against their own government for the sake of it. It is, but it is also, there is a potential conflict, of course, at some point. Like, I mean, if there are just like conflicts of interest between the different nations that far-right activists live in, is there at some point maybe just a natural conflict of interest that will break these coalitions apart, no matter how hard people try? And there have definitely been some scholars who've argued that there have been similar attempts in previous decades, but this is eventually what happens. I think what is changing, or what has been changing, is the creation of the kind of transnationalized online cultures and the transnationalized online identities and ideologies. I think this is a shift from previous decades. And this doesn't mean that every single international far-right project is going to succeed and that they're personally going to get along. But I do think that there has been a shift here facilitated by social media that really makes the current situation a little bit different than we've seen previously.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Jacob says. I mean, connecting and uniting sort of specific political actors is one thing, but I would almost go one step further and to say in terms of ideology and culture, particularly the extreme right, they are broadly united. This is very much seen as a struggle across Europe, which all Europeans are part of. And as a result, the person sat in the UK will find very much affinity with the person sat in Germany. They will see that they're as part of a shared struggle. And maybe this doesn't mean that these groups or the broader extreme right is united with regards to close political infrastructure and close political ties, but maybe that's because that's slightly the wrong paradigm to look at it, to look at this now, because they are united in terms of the sorts of media which they consume, the sources of the media which they consume, the tactics which they deploy to advance their ideology, the broader ideological tropes and narratives which underpin their activity, the infrastructure which drives it, and I think that is something which is going to continue to grow. So I would almost turn this and say, when it comes to extremists, there is quite a lot of unitedness. I will also sort of very quickly say that what we're seeing now increasingly is a shift away, when we're talking about extremist activity, from quite specific groups and quite specific organizations, particularly over the past few years. It's less common to be a card-carrying member of a specific group's branch in your own town when you can be a member of this global community. We really saw this through the spate of terror attacks in 2019 committed by the extreme right wing. Globally, where actually I think none of the people who committed those attacks had formal express affiliation and membership of a group to which could be united to another group, but they were connected into this broader sort of online culture and ecosystem.
Josh Gorfinkel would like to know, a name that appears frequently in American extremist conspiracy theories is that of George Soros. Is that also true in Europe? And in connection to that, Anne Hoppenheimer would like to know, what is the influence of Holocaust deniers on these groups and vice versa?
Yeah, so Soros absolutely is one of the key kind of scapegoats and enemies of the far right in Europe, and a name that's very frequently referenced by many sort of political parties and movements across Europe. And I mean, it really originates in Hungary, to my understanding, and there's a very good BuzzFeed article from a couple of years ago that kind of traces the history of how the Soros the kind of tropes against Soros were sort of weaponized by political consultants working for Mr. Orban in Hungary. But really, I mean, this is stuff obviously that to some extent goes way back. I mean, like if you look at sort of very old data from Stormfront, the American neo-Nazi forum, even in like 2008 or so, you would have found comments by sort of neo-Nazis in Hungary talking about sort of the malign influence of Soros in the country. But I think really during the refugee crisis, it was brought to the mainstream by Viktor Orban, who very much ran a concerted campaign against Soros, at some point actually holding I forget if it was a survey or a referendum on the question of whether or not people were supportive of the Soros plan, the suggestion being that Soros is kind of the puppet master trying to bring migrants into Europe to lead to massive demographic shifts. Often these campaigns were absolutely employing anti-Semitic imagery, portraying Soros in a very specific way. And the Soros plan, obviously, I hope it doesn't need to be added, but it didn't exist. It was sort of merely playing on these fears. And if you look at some of Orban's speeches from the time of the refugee crisis, it's I mean, undeniably that he's playing around with anti-Semitic stereotypes there. This was widely picked up by far-right parties and movements across Europe.
Maybe to come in on the specific question, the follow-up question on Holocaust deniers and the influence there as well. This is something which we did some analysis on last year, in fact, sort of specifically looking at more broadly the responses to different platforms to Holocaust denial. Now, because at this stage, Facebook hadn't taken any action and Holocaust denial was still ripe on that platform, we had the opportunity to do some analysis of sort of 30 different groups associated with the promotion of this. So sort of to that question more broadly, it kind of came in two parts. Depending on where you look at the extreme right, this spectrum, Holocaust denial is incredibly present and incredibly pertinent. It's a core trope which is continually repeated by the extreme right across the spaces which we monitor at the Institute. With regards to sort of conspiracy theory communities, yes, there is also a red dot and a red line which runs through there where we find the presence of Holocaust denial. Now, not all communities promoting conspiracy theories engage in Holocaust denial. I think it's fair to say that there are a number of people to whom that sort of thing doesn't occur, but particularly as those communities become closer to extremist ideology, we see that flow of information. But to flag there, I think it's important to say, and this is what we found in our analysis in particular, Holocaust denial isn't just limited to the extreme right and isn't just limited to conspiracy theory communities. In our analysis of these Facebook groups, I'm trying to remember the numbers now, although I think roughly a third or a quarter were associated with the far right. We similarly found pages associated with the hard left, with Islamist activity, with conspiracy theorist communities, you know, and with other ideologies. So I think when looking at Holocaust denial as an ideological trend, it's something which actually connects extremists beyond the group of actors which Jakob and I have been talking about this afternoon.
Maybe just one very last quick point, because I mean, I think even within the slightly more mainstream bits of the far right in Europe, what you see often is not outright Holocaust denial, but something that's maybe closer to either Holocaust distortion or trivialization, and kind of like in the context of Germany, for example, trying to really kind of certain far-right parties trying to essentially flip around the German memory culture on the Holocaust, trying to present Germans as sort of like non-Jewish Germans as sort of equivalent victims of violence during the Second World War, trying to sort of like refer to the Holocaust memorial in Berlin as a memorial of shame, which isn't sort of like quite the same as saying this event didn't occur. It is more sort of like trying to undermine some of the culture of memory that exists in Europe, and in some cases kind of trying to distort or trivialize the historical facts about it.
Raymond Hermione has another question and would like to know, do you think that conspiracy thinking of the far right and cancel culture of the far left have things in common? Shouldn't both be recognized as dangerous and countered? If so, would this require different approaches?
So I can come in here to start. I would treat these as slightly distinct phenomenon, although phenomenon which are amplified by the same broader dynamics. Far right, they're both sort of relating, I guess, to the position of different communities in the world, negotiation with a world view. But whilst the far right is sort of using that, I suppose, to underline and drive a hateful agenda, what we see on the far left is I would say in a number of times potentially misguided, overtly dogmatic attempts to protect people from the promotion of hatred. I mean, having said that, we do see this broader cancel culture having an influence on sort of radicalization to the right in the same way that far right activity helps fuel that. And what I would say is what connects the both of those is the polarizing dynamic which social media has. So social media is designed in a way to amplify the loudest voices, to amplify the most provocative voices, be they on the left and be they on the right, to drive attention to those communities. And I think that ultimately what you have there is an effect of distortion on the conversation online, which either sways you into one camp or either sways you into the other. And so really my feeling is what needs to be addressed here when you're talking about distortion of conversation, when you're talking about amplification of radical voices on either side, is actually addressing the sort of negative impacts which social media have in terms of driving this, and really prompting social media platforms to have more transparency around how they are amplifying and how they are driving this polarization for profit.
So, I mean, I think I probably wouldn't focus on cancel culture and kind of the analogy to conspiracy theorists. So I will try to think about if there is an analogy. But I think what is quite important is conspiracy theories obviously aren't just exclusively restricted to the far right. I mean, we find it in Islamist contexts, but we also find it in far left contexts. I mean, there's been quite a lot of it's I think, as we can tell from our digital monitoring, it's not quite the same in scale. It's quite usually not quite the same in sort of like the overtful, hateful rhetoric that we find in the most extreme right communities. But we definitely see certain kinds of conspiracy theories that often connect or can lead all the way into anti-Semitic conspiracy theories being endorsed. I mean, for everyone who's been following the kind of debates around anti-Semitism within the UK Labour Party, I'm sure they will have witnessed these kind of statements being made around, you know, the hands of Israel being behind jihadist attacks in Egypt. And so I think that we see the kind of rhetoric of conspiracy theories in the far left as well, even though I think what we see online in terms of the data that we're having, we see a greater overlap between conspiracy theorists and the far right.
We have another question from Paul Kravitz. He is asking, to what degree have far-right extremists tried to blame Jews for COVID-19?
So, what we've seen through our analysis in the UK, but also in a range of other contexts, is extremists pivoting to blame a wide range of minority communities for COVID-19. Now, we have certainly seen anti-Semitic lines run through this, and I touched upon some of those earlier, but on the one hand, blaming Jewish elites for the supposed sort of conspiracy of leaking COVID for global control, that sort of vile rhetoric. Similarly, though, we have also seen sort of a number of more specific local attempts to blame Jewish people for the spread of the coronavirus. So suggestions that the synagogues have acted as sort of hotspots for the flow of the disease, and that has been sort of quite pertinent. But what I'd like to add here is we have also seen those sort of similar tropes and sort of similar racist reactions to COVID play out across a range of minority communities, and we've seen sort of similar hateful rhetoric targeted at Muslims. We've seen a massive uptick of hateful rhetoric targeted at people from East Asia as well, often correlating to spikes in hate crime and of course the Black community and indeed the LGBTQ community. And I think what I think is really important to sort of underline here is these people are driven by their hatred of minority communities, and they will always pivot whatever's happening in the news, be it COVID or be it other some major world event, to try and accommodate their hatred and to try and provide a vehicle for this. So I will see that, yes, we have seen far-right extremists try to blame Jewish people, but this is part of a broader pattern of blaming a wide range of minority communities for the spread of COVID-19. What I would say sort of maybe separates out sort of in terms of the direction of travel of that rhetoric is whilst a common thread has been suggesting that communities in a particular city or in a particular town have been driving the spread of the virus. We have also seen, as I touched upon earlier, the pivot of these groups' conspiratorial narratives to incorporate very long-standing and long-running anti-Semitic tropes as well.
Juliana, I believe we have time for one last question.
Sure, we have one final question from Robert Rosenberg. He's saying that it would be helpful if there was a central repository of far-right incidents. Is there anyone who has such a list, or if not, would people think about having such a list? He's adding that being the case of left and hard right, is it possible to have that list including incidents by all groups? This could be helpful for researchers and governments.
I mean, I agree that would be very, very, very helpful to have such a list. So there's a lot of lists, actually. I mean, so maybe for Robert, there's a journal called Perspectives on Terrorism, which has a sort of constantly updated list of different databases. I think in the latest edition, there was like 40 different databases. And so it really kind of also depends. I mean, this may sound like a simple task, but really what specifically he's interested in, like what country, which region, maybe even, what kind of incidents? Is it just terrorist incidents? Is it hate crime incidents? Is it sort of violent protest mobilization? What ideology is it? There've again and again been attempts made to create these kind of databases, because of course this is really important. It's helpful for people to do research, but it is also really helpful or crucial really to have in order to make an assessment. Is how big is the threat? Is it growing? Has it been worse in the 90s than it is now? And there's a range of both kind of academic databases and civil society databases, and I'm sure some government databases listing different types of incidents there, sometimes more compatible with each other than others. But yeah, I mean, just as a starting point, if you're sort of interested in the kind of science of terrorism and hate crime databases, I think the list of perspectives of terrorism should be quite helpful.
Jacob and Jake, I really want to thank you for taking the time today and really helping our AJC audience understand what's going on over here in Europe with the far-right landscape and also other extremist environments and the connections back to the United States. It's been a really great discussion. You gave a lot of detail and also a great overview of what the situation is that we're facing today. So thank you to both of you. Thank you to the Institute for Strategic Dialogue for allowing you to speak with us today. To the AJC audience, if you want to continue watching other AJC programming, you can find them on our website under Advocacy Anywhere. So thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you at one of our AJC programming again soon. Have a nice evening, everyone, or rest of your day.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.